Welcome back to the Deep Dive, Congress in Context. If you felt Washington was operating under extreme stress recently, you weren't wrong.
No, definitely not.
We are plunging headfirst into the legislative intensity of late October 2025, specifically those 3 days between the 28th and the 30th.
Right.
This period was really the definition of a political pressure cooker. It was marked by a near month-long government shutdown that, well, it exposed critical weaknesses in our domestic safety net.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, Congress got into these high-stakes votes that directly challenged the president's expansive use of executive authority on trade.
That's the perfect framing, really. This wasn't just another week of, procedural motions. The continuation of the shutdown created this kind of zero-sum political environment.
Yeah.
Lawmakers were grappling with genuine, immediate human suffering, unpaid federal workers, looming hunger crises, while also trying to fight these major fundamental battles over who holds the power to tax and, frankly, who controls the courts.
So our mission today is to try and cut through some of that noise and deliver a thoroughly balanced analysis. We'll start by unpacking this devastating political strategy of leverage that really defined the shutdown.
Okay.
Then we'll analyze the immediate threats of the looming hunger and healthcare crises. And finally, we'll dive deep into the Senate's successful, yet maybe ultimately futile efforts to repeal these highly controversial, unilaterally imposed tariffs.
And that procedural trick.
Right, exactly. We'll examine that procedural trick that might just shield those tariffs indefinitely. Okay, let's unpack this crucial context. So the central dynamic throughout this whole period, really dominating every floor debate, was the government shutdown. It was grinding toward the end of its first month.
Mm-hmm. Long time.
And the House, remember, had already adjourned. They'd effectively left town, transferring the immediate political blame and, the negotiating burden entirely onto the Senate.
Yeah, leaving the Senate holding the bag, so to speak.
Exactly. So what was the defining strategy used by the party blocking the funding measures?
Well, the defining theme was brutally simple and, honestly, surprisingly candid. Leverage. We have direct quotes from high-ranking party members, basically confirming that the strategy was to inflict political and financial pain as a negotiating tool.
Wow.
The Democrat whip in the House, for instance, stated it pretty plainly. He acknowledged, of course there will be families that are going to suffer.
He actually said that.
Yes, but he swiftly followed that with the political rationale, saying, but it is one of the few leverage times we have.
That is, wow, a profound moment of political honesty almost. Admitting they view human suffering as, a necessary collateral cost to get their legislative goals.
Pretty much.
But if the political cost of being labeled heartless and mean outweighs the legislative gain, why stick to the strategy for so long? What were they truly hoping to get?
Well, they were holding out for specific long-term policy concessions. Opponents claimed their rivals' demands included things like substantial taxpayer giveaways of health care to illegal immigrants who stormed into this country.
Okay, highly charged language there.
Very. And also a staggering $1.5 trillion in new discretionary government spending. The idea, the calculation was that only the catastrophic pressure of a prolonged shutdown, risking economic stability, could force the opposition to concede on these major budget demands. Another senator described the shutdown tool itself as a very unpleasant tool to use, but, ultimately concluded it was our only moment of leverage.
And how did the opposition push back against this strategy? Because, unpleasant is a massive understatement when you're talking about people not being able to pay rent or get prescriptions filled.
Oh, absolutely. They framed the strategy immediately as the politics of pain. The rhetoric was sharp, deeply critical.
Right.
Senators labeled the strategy heartless, mean, and fundamentally immoral. They argued that their rivals were using the American people as leverage, as pawns in their big game of politics.
So the debate really centered on that moral calculus. Is it ever justifiable to prioritize political wins over the basic function of government and, the financial stability of its workers?
Precisely. That was the core tension.
Let's move beyond the rhetoric for a second and focus on the real-world consequences. What was the tangible impact of this strategy on the ground for, say, essential workers?
Well, the effects were immediate and widely reported. Thousands of essential federal staff, think air traffic controllers, TSA workers keeping travel safe, even Border Patrol staff, they were missing their paychecks.
Yeah.
Union leaders were vocal, warning there was, quote, no excuse for hardworking men and women to show up every day and not know when or even if they would get paid.
That's incredibly stressful.
Hugely. We heard these distressing anecdotes, like a TSA worker reporting that morale is crumbling, just driven by the stress of mounting bills and the uncertainty. And this uncertainty impacts public safety too, right?
Yeah.
A demoralized, financially stressed workforce isn't exactly optimal.
No, definitely not. And what was Congress actually doing to alleviate that? We heard Republicans claim they tried to pass a funding bill multiple times but got blocked. Can you clarify what they were trying to pass and why it was blocked?
Right. So they attempted to pass what's called a Clean Short-Term Continuing Resolution, or CR. A CR is basically just temporary funding. It keeps government operations going at current levels, usually without any big policy changes attached.
Clean, meaning no controversial stuff, just open the government.
Exactly. Republicans claim they voted 13 separate times for such a CR. This one would have funded the government until November 21st and made sure all federal workers got back pay and current pay.
13 times.
13 times, they said. But each time, those efforts were blocked by the opposing party. And the rationale for blocking was consistent. A clean CR would eliminate the leverage. Why negotiate on their big long-term demands if the immediate crisis is solved?
Right, it takes the pressure off.
Mm-hmm.
That brings us to that highly contentious vote about military pay. There was an attempt to carve out funding specifically for active duty service members, reserves, intelligence personnel.
That's right. And it was seen as a critical failure by many. A unanimous consent request was brought forward to pass S. 3079. That bill was solely dedicated to funding pay for active duty, reserves, National Guard, Coast Guard, and intelligence agencies.
Okay, just paychecks for them.
Just the paychecks.
Yeah.
But the request was objected to, which means the bill couldn't pass immediately by that fast-track process.
Why block military pay? I mean, that seems like political suicide for a lot of members.
Well, the official argument given for the objection was based on uncertainty. They argued that funding only the military and intelligence services wouldn't provide long-term certainty for the entire federal workforce. The only way to provide true certainty and stability, they argued, was to open the entire government immediately, basically forcing the opposition to agree to their full demands.
But the counterargument must have been pretty strong.
Oh, inescapable. By blocking a clean CR and blocking military pay, the majority leadership essentially chose to keep the pressure, the leverage on, even if it meant uniformed personnel missed their paychecks. It was a politically very risky decision, and it really underscored how committed they were to their legislative strategy.
Okay, let's move from the immediate political dynamics to the tangible policy consequences. The sources paint a really clear picture. Two massive domestic crises were accelerating precisely because of this: funding, lapse, healthcare, and hunger. Let's start with that financial cliff hanging over millions of insured Americans.
Right. The urgency here was, well, undeniable. Open enrollment for the ACA marketplace was just 3 days away from starting.
Wow, tight timing.
Yeah, and the clock was really ticking down on those enhanced ACA tax credits. These are often called Biden's COVID-era bonus credits, and they substantially increase subsidies for millions of middle-income Americans. If Congress didn't act, those credits would just expire.
And expiration means, directly, massive sticker shock.
We need to put these numbers into context for people listening. What kind of premium increases were we looking at if these credits vanished?
The numbers are, frankly, financially devastating for middle-class families. Let's look at some specific examples that came up during the floor debate.
Go.
Take a couple in Connecticut, both in their 60s, earning $100,000 a year. Under the expiring credits, they pay about $260 a month for their Anthem plan.
Okay, manageable.
Right. If the credits expire, their monthly premium skyrockets to $2,614.60.
Oh, wait, from $260 to over $2,600?
Per month. That's an increase of over $2,350 a month, or nearly $28,000 annually for the exact same coverage. I mean, this isn't just belt-tightening. For most families, it's a financial catastrophe.
That forces impossible choices. Do you keep the coverage or cut back on housing, food, everything else? What about other parts of the country? Was it similar elsewhere? Very similar, yeah. In Colorado, a family of 4 earning $128,000 annually was looking at paying $14,000 more per year. And if that family lived in more rural areas like the Western Slope or Eastern Plains, the increase jumped even higher, somewhere between $16,000 and $21,000 more a year.
Just huge numbers.
Huge. And in Vermont, a family of 4 making $130,000 annually faced an estimated $22,000 increase.
Yeah.
Their monthly cost would go from about $1,200 up to $3,035. Lawmakers were basically arguing that these increases would force millions of Americans to just drop their coverage entirely.
But the opposing side argued that simply extending these credits is, well, fiscally irresponsible. They argued the system itself is fundamentally flawed and needs a complete overhaul. What were their specific structural critiques?
Yeah, the opposition focused on waste, fraud, and what they saw as unintended consequences of the current structure. They pointed out that these Biden COVID credits had eliminated the 400% income cap,
Right.
which meant that even households making over $500,000 a year were suddenly eligible to receive taxpayer-funded subsidies for their health care.
Wait, $500,000 in income, and they're still getting federal subsidies. Is that right?
That was exactly the point the critics were hammering home. Furthermore, they cited massive administrative failure, claiming improper payments totaled something like $27 billion in 2025 alone.
27 billion.
Billion, yes.
Yeah.
They alleged 6.4 million people were improperly enrolled that year, including, get this, 1.6 million individuals who were apparently doubly enrolled in both Medicaid and ACA plans simultaneously.
Wow, okay. That level of alleged waste definitely undermines the program's credibility, regardless of whether you support the goal of expanding coverage.
Exactly.
Does this raise a fundamental question, though? Is this administrative failure unique to the ACA, or does it reflect maybe broader systemic challenges in managing these huge, complex federal programs?
Well, critics argued it reflected a deeper systemic market failure enabled by the ACA structure itself. They noted that the ACA kind of failed on its initial promise to cut costs and make coverage more affordable.
Right, that was the original pitch.
Yeah, and they pointed out that premiums have gone up a massive 221% in the individual marketplace since 2013. The structural argument is pretty simple. When the government basically guarantees to pay any price through subsidies, insurance companies and providers have every incentive to charge the maximum possible price.
So the opposition wanted to focus on controlling the actual medical costs, not just subsidizing them.
Precisely. That was their counter-proposal, essentially.
Okay, so at the same time, Congress was dealing with the immediate reality of people potentially running out of food. The scale of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, is just massive.
It's truly staggering. We're talking about 42 million Americans, that's like 1 in 8 people in the country, who rely on SNAP benefits, what people used to call food stamps.
Yeah.
And this assistance averages only about $6 a day per person, but it is an absolutely critical lifeline for children, for veterans, for seniors.
And the immediate threat of a lapse came from a sudden reversal by the executive branch about contingency funds. Can you explain that?
Yeah, this was a key point. The source material detailed that the Department of Agriculture, the USDA, had previously indicated that emergency contingency funds were, quote, available to ensure SNAP benefits would continue, even during a shutdown.
Okay, so they had a backup plan.
It seemed so. However, the order was suddenly issued for the USDA not to use those funds to pay participant benefits. According to one senator, this critical detail, that the funds were available and then suddenly made unavailable, was literally wiped from the USDA's own website.
Really?
Yeah, which obviously created an immediate crisis and a lot of confusion among beneficiaries.
The political criticism here seemed to center on this really dramatic, almost unbelievable contrast in priorities, didn't it?
Absolutely. Opponents seized on that contrast with intense outrage. They criticized the administration for apparently recently finding $40 billion in U.S. taxpayer money, not millions, billion, to subsidize ranchers in Argentina.
$40 billion for Argentinian ranchers.
That was the claim being made on the floor. Yet simultaneously, the administration was refusing to release funds for SNAP benefits for American families who were about to face hunger. The framing was devastatingly simple. There's money for massive foreign subsidies, but not for feeding veterans and children here at home. And the amount reportedly sent to Argentina far exceeded what was needed to cover the SNAP deficit.
Wow. Was there any meaningful legislative response to this SNAP funding emergency? Did anyone try to fix it?
Yes, there was swift, actually bipartisan acknowledgement that action was needed, despite the shutdown politics.
Yeah.
Democratic members like Senator Lujan introduced S-3071 specifically to appropriate emergency funds for both SNAP and WIC, the Women, Infants, and Children program.
Okay.
And importantly, Democratic leadership, like Senator Schumer, noted the existence of a bipartisan bill introduced by Senator Hawley, who's a conservative Republican, that could theoretically solve the issue immediately.
Yes.
If the leadership would only allow it to come to the floor for a vote, which, again, got tied up in the whole politics of leverage.
Okay. Let's transition now to maybe the most significant constitutional clash of the week. The Senate challenging the president's use of executive authority to impose tariffs. This whole debate hinges on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. For listeners, why is IEPA so controversial when it's used for trade?
Well, IEPA basically allows the president to declare a national emergency and then regulate international commerce.
Mm.
It's typically been used for things like sanctioning rogue states, preventing terrorism financing, or blocking assets during a genuine crisis.
Right, like actual emergencies.
Exactly. Critics argue the current president has stretched this statute way beyond its original intent, using it not for national security emergencies, but really to settle political scores and manage trade policy, which is a power the Constitution explicitly gives to Congress in Article 1, Section 8. One senator even cited that old rallying cry of the Founding Fathers, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." The argument being, if the president can just declare an emergency to impose a tax on imports, well, Congress has effectively given up one of its primary constitutional authorities.
Okay, so let's examine the first successful challenge to that power during this period. Tag A, terminating tariffs on Brazil, SJ-Res 81.
Right. The Senate passed SJ-Res 81 by a pretty significant margin, 52 yeas to 47 nays. This resolution terminates the national emergency that was declared to impose duties on articles imported from Brazil, which had resulted in a massive 50% tariff.
50%. What was the supposed emergency the president cited to justify imposing this huge tax on imports from a major trading partner like Brazil?
Yeah, this is where the IEPA usage became highly suspect, according to critics. They claimed the president was using the emergency declaration solely to settle personal scores and basically exert diplomatic pressure on the Brazilian government about corruption charges against former President Bolsonaro.
So interfering in another country's politics using tariffs.
That was the accusation. The president had publicly called Bolsonaro a disgraced former politician and labeled his prosecution a witch hunt. The sources claimed the tariff was essentially an unprecedented political weapon, not an economic tool.
So the emergency was less about trade imbalances or security and more about, well, international political drama.
Precisely. Critics argued this was the most unusual use of IEPA in American history. And economically, they said, it made no sense. The U.S. actually enjoys a robust trade surplus with Brazil, nearly $30 billion annually, about $7 billion in goods, $23 billion in services.
So who felt the pain?
American consumers, primarily. The immediate consequence wasn't really felt by Brazil, but by us. Brazil is a major source of coffee and beef. Consumers were already seeing coffee prices up 21% from a year ago, and ground beef up 13% tariffs that were effectively taxes paid by American families at the checkout counter. Hashtag candy. Terminating tariffs on Canada. SJ-Res 7.
Okay, the second vote was maybe even more bizarre in its rationale. SJ-Res 77 terminated the emergency regarding Canada, passing 53 yeas to 46 nays. Why on earth were we taxing our closest northern ally?
Well, the stated justification provided by the sources really stretches credulity. The president apparently threatened an additional 10% tariff on Canada on top of the current 35% effective rate, purely in retaliation.
Retaliation for what?
Because the government of Ontario ran an advertisement that quoted Ronald Reagan's 1987 remarks criticizing the dangers of tariffs and trade wars.
You're kidding. An ad quoting Reagan triggered tariffs.
That was the claim presented in the debate. Opponents openly called the president's reaction nonsensical, stupid, and thoughtless. They suggested it was driven by a delicate little ego that couldn't tolerate criticism even from a historical quote by a former president of his own party.
Wow. Okay, beyond the political drama, what were the actual economic stakes of taxing Canada?
Well, the economic ties are immense, right? Canada is Minnesota's #1 trading partner alone. There was $22 billion in goods trade in 2024. These tariffs translate to a quantifiable cost, an estimated $2,000 tax per American family per year.
$2,000?
Per family, per year, hitting essentials like construction materials, aluminum, paper, food, clothing, just everyday items.
There was also a national security argument brought up by the administration, something about fentanyl trafficking, but the data seemed to undermine that claim.
That's a key detail, yeah. While the president cited fentanyl trafficking, critics pointed out this massive discrepancy in seizure data. Nearly 40,000 pounds of fentanyl seized coming from Mexico via the southern border versus only 21 pounds seized on or near the Canadian border in the same year.
40,000 versus 21.
Right. So this led critics to conclude that the justification was really just a pretext, an excuse to defend tariffs imposed for political reasons. The true strategic concern, though, that opponents raised was the risk of driving Canada away from the U.S. These strained relationships could actually push Canada toward re-engaging with, say, China and India for critical minerals, minerals, where the U.S. has invested millions trying to ensure a secure North American supply chain. Kind of counterproductive.
Okay, now despite the Senate successfully challenging the executive power twice here, this all comes down to a crucial procedural insight regarding the House of Representatives. Even with the Senate passing these, the resolutions are likely dead, right? Can you explain that?
Yes, and this is, well, it's a masterclass in exploiting procedural loopholes. Under the law governing these challenges, IEPA challenges, once the Senate passes these privileged joint resolutions, the House is supposed to take action within 18 legislative days.
Okay, a deadline.
Right. This mechanism exists specifically to allow Congress to challenge presidential emergency powers in a timely way. However, the House passed a rule effectively defining day-to-day for privileged consideration of these specific resolutions as lasting through the remainder of Congress.
Wait, so the House essentially passed a rule saying that an 18-day period actually means until the end of the term, possibly a year or more from now.
Exactly. They basically shut the door and threw away the key. This maneuver effectively prevents the matter from ever coming to the floor for that required privileged up or down vote.
Wow.
It indefinitely postpones action until the end of the entire congressional term. And what that does is it shields members of the House from having to take a potentially politically difficult vote on these executive tariffs that are costing their own constituents $2,000 a year.
And it lets the tariffs stay in place.
And it simultaneously allows the executive tariffs to remain in place indefinitely, completely nullifying the Senate's effort to reassert its constitutional trade authority. It's a pretty significant procedural block.
All right, switching gears completely now. The Senate also focused heavily on judicial nominations during this time, which often gives us a clearer view of the ideological battles underway. Let's look at two highly contentious individuals, #####A, contentious judicial nominations.
Yeah, we saw significant debate over Jordan Emery Pratt, who was nominated for the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Florida. Opponents raised some serious concerns regarding his ideological record. They cited his previous work for the Florida Department of Legal Affairs and also the First Liberty Institute.
And what was the issue with that work?
Well, his professional history involved arguing in support of restrictions on abortion rights, opposing transgender rights, and challenging voting rights. Pretty standard conservative legal positions, but controversial nonetheless.
And his critics also linked him directly to some broader, influential conservative policy efforts, didn't they?
They did. Opponents explicitly stated that during his time at First Liberty, that organization was part of the advisory board for Project 2025.
Project 2025, that's that massive, detailed blueprint for the next potential conservative administration.
Exactly. They emphasized that Pratt himself participated in advisory meetings and actually provided research for that effort. This was framed by opponents as evidence that his deep ideological commitments would compromise his objectivity when ruling on cases involving civil and political rights.
Okay. And the other debate involved Edmund G. LaCour, Jr., nominated for the Northern District of Alabama. What were the core objections to his appointment?
With LaCour, critics focused on claims that he repeatedly prioritized state political goals over compliance with federal law and court orders. As Alabama's Solicitor General, he was apparently central to resisting federal court orders, particularly those handed down after the Supreme Court ruled against Alabama in major voting rights cases.
Resisting Supreme Court rulings?
Well, resisting the lower court orders implementing those rulings. Critics claimed he actively helped state legislators draw new, allegedly racially discriminatory maps, even writing talking points for them, after the Supreme Court had already found the state's previous maps violated the Voting Rights Act.
There were also particularly serious and deeply concerning arguments raised regarding his aggressive advocacy on the death penalty.
Yes, that's perhaps the most difficult detail to unpack from the debate. Opponents highlighted his aggressive advocacy for the use of nitrogen suffocation, arguing in support of what they called an untested and inhumane death penalty method.
Nitrogen suffocation.
Yes. Critiques focused on his involvement even in recent executions using this method. They cited the specific case of Anthony Boyd, who was executed just the week before this debate. Justice Sotomayor, joined by Justices Kagan and Jackson, actually dissented from the Supreme Court's denial of a stay in that case.
And what did they say?
They noted reports that Boyd convulsed and heaved for about 15 minutes before being pronounced dead. This led opponents to argue that LaCour's judicial philosophy demonstrates a willingness to prioritize state power over, well, humane and established legal procedures.
That is a moment of really serious, sobering debate happening on the Senate floor. Let's transition now to a separate but also important category of activity, these unique policy debates that touch on everything from environmental science to time zones, hashtag B, unique policy debates. Okay, let's start with a massive land dispute. The Alaska National Petroleum Reserve, or NPR-A SJRES 80, sought to overturn a major land management decision there.
Yeah, this is a huge environmental and economic fight. SJ-Res 80 aimed to overturn the 2022 Bureau of Land Management, the BLM Record of Decision, or ROD. The 2022 plan was vehemently criticized because it unilaterally cut off access to 6.8 million acres of the reserve.
6.8 million acres. How big is that really?
Well, to put that massive area into perspective for you, 6.8 million acres is larger than the combined size of Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Hawaii.
Wow, that's enormous. And who are the main stakeholders fighting to restore access to that land?
Well, the most compelling voices, arguably, were the Alaskan Native leaders, specifically from the Iñupiat community of the Arctic Slope. They spoke very passionately, testifying that resource development is literally the foundation of sustainable North Slope communities. They argued it directly impacts their basic life expectancy and economic survival.
Mm-hmm.
And what's particularly egregious, as it came out in the debate, is that these Native leaders apparently traveled to Washington, D.C. 8 different times to request a meeting with the Interior Secretary about this.
8 times.
8 times. And were refused every single time. So they support SJ-Res 80 to restore the earlier 2020 plan, arguing their lives and culture depend on controlled resource access, which the 2022 plan blocked.
Okay. From immense land reserves, we move to a debate that sounds, well, almost straight out of an ecological comic book. The barred owl versus the spotted owl. What was Congress discussing in this little environmental corner?
Yeah, this involved a highly controversial environmental regulation designed to protect the threatened spotted owl. The core of the regulation is basically a mandate to protect the spotted owl by removing its primary competitor, the barred owl.
Because?
Because the barred owl is described in the sources as simply being a better hunter. It outcompetes the spotted owl.
Chip.
One senator, with maybe a touch of humor, jokingly referred to the policy as DEI for owls, diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it mandates quotas for protecting the weaker species by eliminating the stronger competitor.
DEI for owls. That sounds like a logistically complex and maybe endless task. What about the cost and the efficacy of, killing one type of owl to save another?
Well, the cost is apparently breathtaking. The Department of Interior issued a contract paying professional hunters $3,000 per bird to kill barred owls.
$3,000 per owl.
Per owl. So critics argued this program is fiscally irresponsible and maybe structurally flawed. They noted that the spotted owl population was already declining due to habitat destruction, things like logging and fires, not just competition from barred owls.
Right.
Furthermore, critics argued that the barred owl, being an intelligent animal, will probably just move north to Canada when hunted and then return immediately when the coast is clear, potentially rendering this extremely expensive program ultimately ineffective.
Okay, let's shift gears from wildlife conservation to time conservation. The perennial debate over the Sunshine Protection Act, which aims to make daylight saving time permanent.
Ah, yes, the clock change debate. This focuses on public health and modern convenience. Proponents argue for permanent DST based on studies suggesting some serious health impacts from the twice-a-year clock change. They cited statistics showing things like a 6% spike in fatal car accidents and even a 24% higher risk of heart attacks connected to the time change. They also argue the historical reasons for DST, like fuel conservation during World War I and II, are pretty much obsolete now that we have electricity and global supply chains.
And just ending the annoyance of changing the clock twice a year is probably a popular selling point.
Definitely. But opponents cite serious concerns about the social impact of permanent DST, particularly in the winter months.
What are those concerns?
Well, they argue that permanent DST would push winter sunrises to an absurdly late hour. In many parts of the country, the sun wouldn't rise until after 8 a.m., or even 8:30 a.m. during the dead of winter.
That is late.
Yeah. This negatively impacts morning workers, farmers, and crucially, children walking to school or waiting for the bus in the dark, potentially increasing traffic risks. They basically concluded that our internal body clocks, our circadian rhythms, are more closely aligned with standard time, not DST.
Okay. Finally, we saw 2 notable House bill introductions referred to committees this week. Anything significant there?
Just briefly, H.R. 5840 aims to allow charitable donations of food transportation vehicles and food storage equipment to get the same tax treatment as charitable donations of food inventory itself. It's kind of a technical fix, but potentially important for helping food banks operate.
Okay.
And H.R. 5841 seeks to amend the Social Security Act to require the Commissioner of Social Security to use the Consumer Price Index for elderly consumers, the CPIE, for determining cost of living adjustments. Many argue that index better reflects the actual expenses faced by seniors compared to the standard CPI. ####C. Oversight and ethics.
All right, to close out this section, we have to cover the extraordinary ethics issues brought up this week, including a massive financial request from the president himself.
Yeah, this development is highly unusual and immediately raised legal red flags. President Trump is apparently seeking a staggering $230 million in payment from the Department of Justice.
From his own DOJ.
From the DOJ, an agency that falls under the executive branch he oversees. Critics immediately questioned whether this violates the Domestic Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, as well as various federal ethics laws. I mean, it's a strange dynamic, the president potentially benefiting financially from an action within his own government.
Did the president comment on that?
He did, actually. He even admitted during the debate, quote, "It's awfully strange to make a decision where I'm paying myself."
Huh. Okay. And separately, we saw a resolution introduced to condemn a highly controversial executive pardon.
Yes, a Senate resolution was introduced to condemn the pardon of Changpeng Zhao, known as CZ, the former CEO of Binance.
Right, the big crypto exchange.
Exactly. His company had pleaded guilty to extremely serious crimes, including failing to prevent money laundering and facilitating billions of dollars in flow to sanctioned regimes, child sex abusers, and even terrorist organizations. Democrats argued the pardon was improperly granted because CZ apparently had significant business dealings with the Trump family crypto platform.
Was that condemnation resolution able to pass? Did it go anywhere?
No, the resolution was blocked by objection. The senator objecting cited Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 of the Constitution, which grants the president complete and broad discretion in issuing executive clemency or pardons.
So basically saying the president has the power, like it or not.
Exactly. The objection effectively argued that while the pardon might be politically unsavory or ethically questionable, it was constitutionally protected presidential power. #6, future implications and citizen engagement.
Okay, so this was clearly a week characterized by these high-stakes tariff challenges on one hand, and maybe low-stakes shutdown politics, at least in terms of resolution, on the other. Looking ahead, what key votes should listeners anticipate coming up next week?
Well, the Senate schedule is already set for several critical votes pretty soon. The most anticipated is probably SJ Res 88. That's the resolution calling for the repeal of all of Donald Trump's global tariffs, not just the ones on Brazil and Canada we discussed.
So the big one.
The big one, yeah. That vote will really determine if the Senate is willing to fully commit to overturning this executive trade tax strategy. Additionally, we expect confirmation votes for those contentious judicial nominees we discussed, LaCour, Dunlap, and Tung. Those are scheduled no earlier than November 4th or 5th.
Okay. And what are the key committee hearings that people listening should maybe watch to understand the ongoing policy direction on these issues?
We have 3 critical hearings scheduled soon that directly touch on the issues we've analyzed today. The Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, HELP, will hold a hearing on the future of biotech and U.S. competitiveness. Critically, the Indian Affairs Committee has scheduled a hearing specifically to examine the impacts of government shutdowns on Native communities. That's a direct outgrowth of the NPR-A debate and, the general shutdown crisis.
Right, connecting back to that Alaska issue.
Exactly. And finally, the Veterans Affairs Committee is holding a hearing to examine the current VA disability system. So some important oversight happening there.
For listeners who want to track the core issues we discussed today, particularly this battle over executive tariffs, what is the most important legal and procedural context for them to keep in mind if they want to engage?
Yeah, it's essential to remember that the core of this battle is Congress attempting to reassert its constitutional authority over trade. That power is explicitly granted in Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 and I of the Constitution.
So it's Congress's job constitutionally.
It is. So citizens need to track these joint resolutions, SJ-RIS 8177 and the pending SJ-RIS 88, because they are really the only available mechanism under current law to challenge these presidential emergency powers used for tariffs. But here is the key takeaway for action, for you, the listener.
Okay.
Because the House has indefinitely postponed privilege consideration through that procedural rule change we talked about.
Right, the end of Congress definition.
Citizens who want an end to these tariffs must focus their advocacy and pressure directly on House leadership and their individual representatives in the House. The ability of the executive branch to impose this multi-billion-dollar tax without representation rests entirely, right now, on that procedural loophole holding firm in the House. #7 outro.
So what does this highly detailed period of congressional activity ultimately reveal? I mean, these 3 days, October 28th to 30th, they really showed Congress operating at two extremes. Immense procedural savvy, like that House rule change, and maybe intense moral failure.
Mhm.
We saw lawmakers willing to wrestle with these high constitutional questions of executive power, successful voting, at least in the Senate, to repeal tariffs imposed via unilateral emergency declarations. Yet at the very same time, that same political system was paralyzed, unable to perform the basic function of funding the government and preventing immediate human suffering, withheld S&IP benefits, unpaid federal salaries, all in the name of political leverage.
It really does create a dangerous paradox. The Senate showed it still holds the constitutional power, on paper, to debate and terminate what it views as executive taxes on trade. But its failure to govern in the immediate short term suggests that perhaps the most powerful form of leverage today is inflicting controlled, calculated pain on the American public.
Which leads to this really interesting question and something for you to consider as you reflect on this deep dive. Given the intense week-long focus in the Senate on terminating tariffs because they impose an average $2,000 tax burden on American families, a figure that drew immense political outrage, what does it fundamentally imply about the structural weakness of the IEPA statute itself? Does the mere existence of a law that allows such massive unilateral taxation without representation, as one senator put it, mean that Congress has maybe already permanently surrendered that foundational constitutional power, regardless of how many resolutions the Senate manages to pass?
That is the defining question of executive power today, I think. If the House can use procedural tricks like this one to essentially insulate the president from accountability on something like trade taxes, then the IEPA statute effectively risks rendering the constitutional guarantee of congressional control over commerce, well, null and void in practice.
A perfect and frankly pretty disturbing thought to close on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Congress in context. We'll be here next time to continue unpacking the legislative world for you.